Hi, everybody. I'm Elysabeth Alfano, host of the Plant-Based Business Hour. Thanks for being with me today. Today, we're going to dive into something technologically I wouldn't think is possible, but indeed it is. Can we print meat? Let's find out. I want to bring on the head of business at MeaTech3D. Really, MeaTech is the name of the company, but you're most known for 3D printing. I can't wait to get into it. Simon Fried, thank you for being here with me.
Absolute pleasure. Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for hosting me.
I'm so happy that you're here because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really sort of out of my general understanding of how the world works. We're going to get into something called bioinks. Okay, but before we jump that far ahead, let's start with, I'll say, the basics, which is probably, old school for you, cultivated meat. So even before we get to 3D printing, could you explain for us the process of cultivated meat, which is something you also do at MeaTech?
Sure. Yeah. So cultivated meat should probably start with everybody just imagining what it would be like if one could make meat but take animals out of the equation. And that's not to say that what's being done in the plant-based space isn't also phenomenal, but there's another way, and there's a new kid on the block, you could say, technologically speaking, where the goal is to allow the cells that are part of the meat that's loved and eaten by many to be something that one can grow, but without having to grow the whole animal. Mm-hmm. So the mission there is creating an environment where cells, which you have to be taken either from an animal at the beginning of research, but ultimately can actually just be stored in banks so that you don't need to keep going back for samples, to allow those to grow in a controlled environment in containers that are not too different to what you'd use when you make beer. So it's not technically fermentation, but it's about using large, oftentimes stainless steel or glass containers. And they need to do a few things to keep the cells happy. I mean, what kind of things do cells need? They need to be kept nice and warm. They're mammalian. So if you keep them at 36, 37 degrees, you don't want them getting hypothermia. You don't want them getting overheated. They need to be fed. So they need to have a source of energy to consume. They need to be able to have access to various types of nutrients and what are called growth factors to allow them to multiply. And it's rather a magical thing, because any of you who sort of remember back maybe to biology studied at school, or maybe even more recently if you're lucky enough, you'll remember that cells have this tendency to multiply by division, which sounds like a tricky math question. But actually, once a day, depending on the cell type, they will essentially split down the middle, and suddenly you have two cells. And the next day, those two will have split again, and you'll actually suddenly find yourself with double the amount of cells. So this is an exponential situation. Now, if you think of that as a way of manufacturing things, exponential has the potential to be phenomenal, in that you're doubling the volume of whatever you're doing every day. This is really why so many people are very excited about the potential for cultured meat, and that is just cells grown essentially outside of the body of the animal. And it does put people into the mode of thinking, oh my goodness, this is a little bit too scientific. What's going on? Do I really want to eat this stuff? Because that's an understandable reaction. And actually, in many ways, the whole space of cultured meat has been changing its name. If you go back maybe 10 years ago, it would have been called lab-grown meat, and then It was called in vitro meat. And then they thought, well, that's probably also a little bit too science-sounding, so maybe we should call it cultured meat or cultivated meat, and some thought clean meat. So it's a child of many names, and I think part of that is this need to communicate that this is actually something. Yes, it was born because of laboratory science, but that's no reason to look at it as if it's something that's in any way threatening or problematic. It's merely allowing those cells to grow in an environment that is a bit different to the one that would require us otherwise to slaughter animals.
Okay, so much to unpack there, and we will get to printed meat, but I want to first ask a couple of questions. I do remember from high school science when cells divide and divide again and divide again. I had forgotten that it was on a daily basis. Is that something cells do naturally, or are they doing that because you're giving growth hormone or something like that?
So different cell types in different animals or different plants, etc., in a different context, different behaviors. But the types of cells that are typically used in cultured meat are either stem cells or stem-like cells that have the potential to become any range of other cells. And those types of cells typically, it's about once a day. Sometimes it might be a bit more frequently. Sometimes it might be a bit less frequently. But they have their cadence of cell division, and we're essentially replicating that.
Yeah, that's so neat. Okay, so I've been hearing, when I first learned of cultivated meat, I think at that point it was called cell meat, I did also hear of fetal bovine serum. And when I interview people in this space, they all say fetal bovine serum will never be used at scale. It's too expensive. It's inefficient, all of these sort of things. In addition, for those who may not know, fetal bovine serum is a serum taken from the babies in vitro, in womb, I think, of a mother cow that's being slaughtered. So it goes against the mission. If you're trying to get animals out of the supply chain, it's really not a great place to start. And yet, I think we're still there. Is that accurate, that we are still using fetal bovine serum, and when will we no longer use fetal bovine serum?
So I think it's certainly accurate to say that the vast majority of companies are still using it at the research and development stage, and that's because there's a great deal of scientific effort required in order to bring these kind of technologies to market, and certainly to bring them to scale. And much of the research that underpins this whole area of cultured meat has its origins, in regenerative medicine, where quantities were not necessarily that important and price points were not that important. So there are several drivers for why FBS, as it's known, is really not going to be a relevant material to use in food production. Firstly, absolutely, it's the price. Secondly, it's an animal-derived input, which makes it antithetical to the ethics of the whole space and the aspirations of the space, and undermines really the message of it all. So I think it's fair to say, and like it or not, and there are obviously those that don't like it, that it's a necessary evil, essentially at the beginning of the research phase, that allows companies, and we're also using it in R&D as well, to make as rapid progress as possible, in order to leave that kind of an input behind. We've certainly done lots of research into looking at plant-derived sources to replace those growth factors, and I think that would be the case for any company in this space. So I think for now, one can certainly say this is not the kind of input we want to be hearing about. I think that there's no company I can think of that would want to continue that and would be able to continue it profitably.
Understood. And I think fetal bovine serum is one of the things that is making it, as we talked about, difficult to scale, and thus keeping it a bit from market. I mean, there's also other things as well. So there's the infrastructure of just building this whole new food supply that wasn't there before. Yes, we do have some beer vats, we do ferment. We have been fermenting for centuries now, but it's not necessarily clear if things like large beer vats can be converted over, this kind of thing. So it takes a lot of infrastructure to build that whole supply chain. And then also the cost of FBS, fetal bovine serum, and innovating around it to have another option. So these are some of the reasons, I think, but of course would want to hear it from you, that we're holding back we don't have scale yet, in addition to the consumer, which we'll talk about in a second. But are those really the main factors for holding us back from scale?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I mean, FBS is something that many companies are now looking at plant-derived sources for. That's also part of what's necessary to drive the cost of this type of manufacturing down. The bioreactors, or the like fermenter-like equipment, again, this is an industry where we're dealing with living cells, and they're very sensitive, and anything that can possibly harm them or cause them to not proliferate essentially will do so. So it has to be a very, very carefully controlled environment. It's important to monitor things like acidity, because too much or too little is no good. So pH is critical, and temperature is critical, and oxygen is critical, and CO2 quantities are critical, because it's such a finely balanced environment in our bodies, or in any mammalian body or animal body, and that's what one has to replicate. So it's a little bit harder than using the yeasts in fermentation, who are pretty good at looking after themselves. And I'm a passionate beer brewer and whiskey maker myself, And so I'm fully aware of the delicacy even with yeasts, and how ultimately if they get carried away, they end up killing themselves in their own
Yeah.
alcohol. And cells would do much the same, because they're only part of the whole body. So we really have to replicate so many processes, and biology has yet to allow us to scale up to the volumes that you'd see in a Budweiser brewery or something of that kind. So this is an industry that will go to market initially probably with relatively expensive products that won't be able to be produced at gargantuan and enormous quantities, but it's an incremental process of discovery and improvement, month after month, year after year.
Yeah, it's so very exciting. Many people think like, oh, but will the consumer accept this new kind of food? I'm maybe not even explain that right, because it's a new technology. I don't know if we're going to see a new food. I think we're going to see a very old food from a new technology. And I actually think in many ways that the consumer is going to be more receptive to cellular meat than cultivated meat than plant-based meat, because there's this huge conception that plant-based isn't going to taste good. It's going to be dry. It's not going to have fat. It's just not going to be the indulgent thing I love. I don't know that people are so tied to where their meat comes from. I think they just want meat. So it's sort of two sides of one coin. Cellular meat, cultivated meat, is the death of animal agriculture. Why would you ever choose animal agriculture? It's so wasteful. It's inefficient. It's cruel. It's got hormones and antibiotics. And just why would you want it? Pandemics, we could go on. But also, I think people are going to quickly make the intellectual leap. Like, it's still meat. I don't know. What do you think about that? How long do you think it will take for the consumer to get on board?
Well, as with any new technology, people are, I think, justified or understandably at times on the fence until proven otherwise. And it's partly even at times a sort of a political statement as well. One takes a side, not wanting to stray into too much of politics, but you can look at how people deal with how they feel about vaccinations or whether they're good or bad, and which and many of these things may well relate one to the other. Most consumer surveys indicate that people are very excited about the thought of cultured meat, that typically once they've had the chance to understand what's going on, and that it really is, the cells wouldn't allow themselves to be cultivated in anything other than pretty much the environment that they're destined to be naturally. And so we're replicating a natural process, just without many of the downsides. So we fully expect that people will come around to seeing this as a perfectly valid way of making something that is quite traditional. That said, it may well be that there are aspects of this technology that could make meat even better than it is today. Maybe it might be healthier. Maybe the profiles of the fats from a saturated fat perspective could be even better. So there's great potential to think about not just the improvement to ethics and sustainability, but it may well be that there's opportunity for the nutritional side of it to be an improvement as well. And that, I think, might be the ultimate convincing argument, where not only does it have none of the environmental downsides or the ethical downsides, but it's actually of benefit health-wise, which seems to be one of the pushbacks, I think, for the plant-based space, where at least the number of ingredients seem to be causing people to ask questions about how good is this for me. Now, obviously, each plant-based offering has its fortes and they're different. I certainly wouldn't get into pointing fingers, but I think people tend to like ingredient lists that are short and that feel natural. And to the extent that cultured meat can do that, I think it'll be popular as a result.
Yeah, I think it's really an exciting space. So again, so much to unpack there. It's hard for me to have these conversations around natural, because if you think meat is natural, then I encourage you to look at factory farm videos. They are everywhere, not hard to find. They're part of American culture, worldly, global culture. So if you think that the situation that our animals find themselves in factory farms is natural, then we have a different understanding of the word natural. So I would say that meat is not currently in its scale. There might be a situation or two, but on any kind of real numbers, there's nothing natural about the way meat is made today. So I think this is much more of a natural situation as we talk about natural, but the list of ingredients is also sort of a fluid conversation. You can have a smoothie that has 15 types of berries and flaxseed in it. That would be considered very healthy with a very long list of ingredients. So, and also meat that we see today, at least in the United States, they're not obligated to tell you what's in the meat. So that meat has been poked with hormones and also saline and salt. And, these are things that are marketing to the negative, if you will, sort of misinformation on purpose. So and then now we get political, misinformation on purpose, and we go to politics. So lots to uncover there, but we won't. We'll move on and we'll go to meat printing. Now, you had me at cultured meat. But meat printing, I can't. I don't know, my brain, it's not working. The bio inks, walk us through, and I'm going to share my screen now and show your website because it helps for people to see the visual while you explain how we print meat.
Great. Yeah. So first of all, we touched on what cultured meat or cultivated meat is, and that's allowing these cells to proliferate or to grow and to divide. And as you can see here, that initial sample, in some cases, one needs to go back, certainly during R&D, we hope that in the future we'll be able to go back to a cell bank that is essentially frozen. So the involvement of animals can really be brought to an absolute minimal, potentially one day even no involvement at all. And those cells need then to be placed into a condition and environment where they're happy to grow and proliferate. And that's, in our case, it's stem cells. So we take those stem cells, and the magic of stem cells is that they can become any cell in the body. And that means that if you know how to control the process, you can nudge them, shall we say, to turn into the type of cell that's needed, that one wants for food. So the first stage where it there says growing cells, that's where we're multiplying the number of stem cells that we have. We start with that small sample, and through that exponential process, you can get very quickly to quite a large volume of cells. We can think of replicating something the size of a cow, perhaps, in shall we say 3 to 4 weeks from even the very smallest sample of cells. So not only is this, we believe, a much cleaner process, and obviously has fewer sustainability issues and ethical issues, but it's also, and this I think is crucial, from a business perspective, it's also much faster. And so this growing phase allows one to produce what is in the industry is called biomass. It's essentially allowing those cells to multiply. So then one has a large number of cells, but they're still stem cells. So the next phase then in this kind of technology is what's called differentiation, where you control the environment that those stem cells are in, and one can nudge them. So you can nudge them to become fat cells, and you can nudge others to become muscle cells, which are basically what people are looking to have in their food. So one goes from having a stem cell sample to many stem cells to then convincing some of them to become fat, some of them to become muscle. And you can almost think of this is product category number one, because if you want to turn those into something like a meatball or a hamburger type product, then you simply need to mix them together essentially, and then you have the main components of the food. Another thing that's really exciting, I think, for those that are in the plant-based space, is companies beginning to look at how one can create what are called hybrid products, where you perhaps take a little bit. In our case, we've been doing this with chicken fat, and adding a little bit of cultivated chicken fat, so that's been grown in these conditions, and adding it to plant-based nuggets, for example. So the body of the food is either soy or pea, but the flavor, the aroma, and the richness of the mouthfeel can come from what are fats that are actually what you could call animal cells, but again, they haven't impacted the animal negatively. And it changes the aroma, it changes the number of ingredients. Oftentimes having to use coconut or palm oils, you don't get the same juiciness. You tend to get greasiness. You don't necessarily know where your palm oil has come from, because there's a lot of sustainability issues there in the background as well. So we think it's a very promising way to build bridges between these two spaces, especially for as long as the cultivated products are a bit pricey. So this is one stage of the process. But we believe that, there are a lot of folks out there who live for their barbecues, and when you tell them about meat, they think about their steak knife, and they think about the fibers, and they think about the whole ceremony of having a cut of meat as central to being festive and to having the friends over at the weekend or 4th of July or whatever celebration it is. Oftentimes you'll find a steak somewhere in the middle of it. And so our goal really is to see how can we get as many people as possible. Is there a product out there that could get everyone into cultivated meats rather than traditional, conventional, potentially industrially produced meats they are today, the way they are today? And that means an additional technology on top of growing the cells, as we just saw. We need to keep those cells alive. So we have some fat cells and we have some muscle cells, and they need to be printable. And you can imagine like the printing you have perhaps in your printer at home, where you have different colors of ink. You might have your YMCK or your RGB, or depending on what kind of printer you have, you'll have different colors. And so imagine here, instead of different colors, you've essentially got different cells, and they need to be in a liquid that can keep them happy and keep them alive, and the temperature and so on, everything that was necessary and relevant at the time we were multiplying the number of cells holds during the printing as well. So the ink is more to keep them in the right sort of viscosity in an environment. The printing is quite quick. So then those inks go, and they contain the same cells, but we want to structure them differently. And that's because it's one thing to have meatballs or hamburgers, and they're great and they're fun products. But if we're working with living cells, which is what is being done, it's possible using a printer to start thinking about them three-dimensionally. And that means, where do you want the fat to go? Where do you want the muscle to go? What's the kind of structure that one needs? And some folks, want to have high fat content. Maybe they're feeling like celebrating, something festive, and they say, I've always wanted to try, very marbled Kobe beef. I want it to be as soft as possible. And then you essentially upload that design or those instructions to the printer and say, hey, this one, we want a lot of fat. We want it marbled throughout. So the printer knows to place whichever one of those ingredients in the precise location that it needs to be in. And it's not just fat and muscle, because you need something to give it all structure, to keep them all in place, because the cells would otherwise be a bit wobbly and move around.
Yes. Why doesn't it fall apart?
So that's another one of we wouldn't call them a bioink per se, but they're inks that we're using to give structure, to hold things in place. They can also serve a purpose of helping the cells to continue having access to nutrition and so on. Because after the printing phase, if you want those cells, and they're still living cells, if you want them to continue developing, to start connecting to their neighbors, and to start to essentially turn themselves into what we might describe as a cut of meat, although of course there's no cutting involved, it's something that you would normally know as a cut of meat. You need to give those cells some time after printing, and we expect this is something that will be a 10 days or 2 weeks process thereabouts, where those cells are given the time to essentially connect to their neighbors, to start to build those sort of fibers that we'd recognize from a traditional steak. And only after one's been able to put the cells in the right location and allow them to connect to their neighbors, do you have something that then resembles a cut of meat. So that's what we believe is we call it the holy grail product, or a way to get really into the center of the plate or into the center of the barbecue, which is where we think we'll have the best opportunity to convince everybody that you don't have to compromise. You should be able to have your steak and eat it, essentially.
So is this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Is this mimicking sort of what happens in the animal anyway? You have all of these cells coming together, and they find each other, and they build bridges, and they grow in the animal from there. And is that sort of the process? Or is it more like meat deconstructed? So it's like you've taken all the separate elements and you've put them together, like building a Lego, but more like in liquid with the structure, and then the cells find each other. I hope I haven't made this more complicated.
No, I think that was actually really an interesting way of looking at it, because nature, when you think of maybe an embryo or something like that, is is starting with very few cells that
Right.
you can almost say magically know where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to do, and they appear at the right time. And anybody who looks, at a video of an embryo in the womb can be absolutely mesmerized by the knowledge that is baked into these cells. They know what to do, when, where, and how, etc. So we're not fortunate enough to be able to rely on that sort of programming. So instead, we're essentially replicating it. And you're absolutely right. It's more like Lego. So we're able to turn the stem cells into the types of cells we want, but we do need then to physically place them in the right location, because they wouldn't self-assemble in that way. And then they do need to be given time to start connecting. They do retain some of their autopilot behaviors when they're in the right context, in terms of how they start to adhere to their neighbors, and they'll respond, for example, to stimulus as well. Muscles develop more quickly if they're stimulated, either mechanically or electrically in some way. And so those sorts of innate built-in programs are there, but you could say it's part Lego and then letting nature take over.
I love that. Legos that can communicate between themselves. Okay, Legos, I understand. So maybe I'll stop there while I'm sort of ahead. You mentioned that you add fat, and that even a little bit of cultivated fat can, really help to change the taste and texture of things. This is, of course, no surprise to people. And I noticed that your company, MeaTech3D, has acquired Piece of Meat, a Belgian company that does cultivated fat. And I wondered if that was a pretty recent acquisition. I want to say maybe 2020.
It was really completed in the first quarter of this year, so even more recent.
Even more recent than that. I knew it was the first quarter. I couldn't remember if it was 2020 or 2021. But do you anticipate other acquisitions as you try to build out your pieces of Lego?
So it's certainly possible. I mean, the company is a listed company. So MeaTech is a NASDAQ listed company. Some of the rationale that the founders have for why it's a listed company is because that tends to make mergers and acquisitions a little bit easier to do. And that was one of the things that was shown by the Piece of Meat acquisition, because to get, not to get too technical, but it, for example, allows an easier use of, say, equity or shares as part of a transaction. And so it affords some extra flexibility. And certainly the company is on record saying that that's a platform. And when sensible, judicious due diligence and strategic planning may well allow us to continue looking for suitable candidates. And this is such an exciting space with so many new technologies cropping up. And some of them are what you'd call ecosystem technologies, where the underlying technologies, maybe it's ways to use media more effectively, the cell culturing media that the cells are grown in. Maybe it's particular aspects of how to use a bioreactor, for example, that can always be made a bit more efficient or have slightly higher yield. So
scaffolding.
Yeah, and scaffolding as well. So these ecosystem technologies are something which may well emerge, and they could be really fantastic. And then one has to decide, do we want to be just a customer for this, or is this something that we find so exciting that we'd like to bring it in-house? I think Piece of Meat was a great example of that, where we felt that what they were doing, which is really focusing on producing cultivated fats as an ingredient, was something that might allow this industry to progress more quickly. It's perhaps a slightly lower hanging fruit in terms of the technological readiness. And so that for us made a lot of sense to add to the work we were doing on bioprinting.
Well, you sort of stole my thunder there in a little bit, because my next question was going to be about the NASDAQ. And it's interesting that you're listed on the NASDAQ. And it's interesting to hear you say, as a publicly interested company, that one of the attractions to doing that, which is a burdensome process, not necessarily an easy process, was so that you could perhaps acquire other companies more readily. Just so I paint the picture for people, you didn't start on the NASDAQ. You started on the Israeli stock exchange, if I have that right. And then you transferred over to the NASDAQ. And I thought it was an interesting move because you chose to do that pre-revenue, which is, so perhaps you could walk me through a little bit, since you're head of business. So you are overall arching for the company. If you could, I'd love to know the rationale for going to market before revenue.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly folks who follow the stock exchange closely will certainly be aware that the majority of companies there are established companies, and people think about, when should we go public? How many dollars of revenue should we have at the time we go public? And that's oftentimes because the whole system works on banks and analysts who speak the language of how profitable is it and what are the dividends going to be like. And many of the ratios that the analysts are known to be focusing on relate to the profitability or otherwise of a company. In the case of MeaTech, and it's not unique, but it's certainly a minority scenario where companies sometimes go public before they have revenues, and certainly MeaTech is one of those. And there's no revenue to speak of for the time being, but it does allow access to quite deep pools of capital. It allows companies to raise money, and I think perhaps an analogous sector would be people who are familiar with investing in biotech companies. It's not unusual for companies in the biotechnology space to go public long before there's any likelihood of them having revenues. Oftentimes, actually, the way they get measured is on how they're progressing through FDA approvals processes. So they're climbing that FDA ladder on their way to having a legally sellable product. And I think in many ways, companies that go public before that are perhaps quite similar. We don't have to jump through the same kinds of hoops that a pharma, a small biotech pharma company would have to, but we certainly have to be sure that we keep a very close and transparent relationship with our investors and with the investment community at large, because ultimately, we need to be showing progress. We need to be sharing our activities. So we make every effort that we can to make sure that we're not quiet about what's going on. Indeed, it's very, very important for us to have as open a connection with our investors as possible.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, again, it is such a heavy process to go through. So, but I see what you're saying about tech companies, and that does make sense for biotech companies that are more about innovation, perhaps, than revenue early on. But I'm wondering if you can share. So I think I saw your market cap today, give or take, is around 80 million. But when you went public, I don't know if you can share how much capital you were able to raise. Obviously, that's one of the most attractive things you can do in going on the public markets is raise a whole lot of cash. So you were the NASDAQ this year, I think, but you were the Israeli stock market last year. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. And how much money were you able to raise, and how has that helped you? Obviously, money helps you, but how much of it was there?
Yeah, so the raise in March, as we joined the Nasdaq, I think all told it was in the region of sort of high 20s of millions of dollars, about 28 million, and running up to that, a not dissimilar amount was raised during the previous year, roughly speaking. And really the goal there was twofold. One was to carry out the plan of the original work that's being done at MeaTech here in Israel, which is focusing on beef cells, focusing on the 3D printing systems that we're developing ourselves, so that the whole sort of printing process and the equipment and so on. But it was also in order to fund the acquisition of Piece of Meat. So a fair bit of that money has gone into merging those companies and now also paying for their activities.
Well, that's a good chunk of change. So 28 times 2, 56. That's pretty good. Does this also help you? I don't know if that's actually the right way to phrase it, but how does this position you against your competitors, the fact that you are a publicly traded company? And just generally speaking, what do you think about the competitive landscape? Obviously, we are so far from market for these kind of products, and just in its initial really innovative stages, trying to get some good test products out would be a great accomplishment, for example. I'm wondering, there are a lot of more and more companies getting in this space. I think a lot of people see this as the answer to the future of food. So how are you looking at the competitive landscape? Are you working in conjunction with other competitors? How do you see the landscape taking shape?
Yeah, I think it's one of these spaces where many of the people getting involved in it are doing it because it's a way of doing well by doing good, essentially. And so there is a somewhat of a community of people who are really on a mission. So that's one thing that makes it, I think, different to many other areas. It's also true. This was a term that I picked up when I lived in the Bay Area for a while. This notion of pre-competitive collaboration, where companies or industries that are really a little bit before becoming active in sales and so on, they have a shared and common interest. And I think you see that when it comes to dealing with regulatory bodies, when it comes to the various symposia and conferences in this space, one can really feel that the companies are collaborating with one another. But inevitably, of course, you're collaborating with people who at some point down the road will also be a competitor. The good thing here is that I think there's that mission component. B, it's early days, and finally, it's such an enormous market. There's so much room for many companies that it really isn't a zero-sum competition. It's not that somebody else's success is necessarily any other company's loss at this stage of the game. And I think that also helps the companies to make sure that there's no reason to squabble this early on.
Well, interesting that you say that because, excuse me, business is very open to that sometimes. Collaborative efforts, particularly in the beginning, where it's more about open data and attacking a problem and getting through regulatory processes than it is about sales, because you're not at sales yet. But governments, don't see it that way. Governments are often a zero-sum game. And I think the Israeli government has done such a great job of having this beautiful triangle of universities and entrepreneurs, scientists, inventors, and government funded by research with its support. I think your former, because MeaTech3D, I don't know if I said this, is in Israel, headquartered in Israel. Your former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that he wanted to see Israeli out in front as a leader in the world of cellular meat. And when you think about a global shifting food supply system and food insecurity and how cellular meat answers this quest for food and protein, because it's more than just protein. We need lots of quantities of food, but then we need nutritious food for a growing population. You see the power that a particular government can have when they have food security and stability, and maybe they even become an exporter of food to others. When you start controlling people's food, you have a lot of power. So I'm wondering if you can comment at all about that relationship you've had with the Israeli government, how they've been supportive, and if you care to comment on the geopolitical situation of food insecurity and how governments are going to gather around that or against each other for that.
Certainly. I mean, I think it's very specific to the cultured meat space here in Israel, that one sees tremendous interaction between the various research institutions, the Innovation Authority here, which is essentially a government-funded innovation funding body, and the engagement with also a big business. So Israel is fortunate enough to be a place where entrepreneurialism and startups in a whole host of technology areas is now something that is quite embedded in how the economy here works. And I think that's something that's difficult to replicate, and it takes time, and it's partly culture, and it's partly societal structures, and it's partly government involvement, and it's also just the fact that this is now maybe the third, fourth, or fifth generation of entrepreneurs. Oftentimes, people here are on their third or fourth or fifth startup, whether they're founders or employees. Wow. This is an environment where this is a viable option. It's not an esoteric, strange thing to be doing when really your parents wanted you to be a lawyer or a doctor. You can do a startup as well. So there's certainly that. But I think it's very important, and I think this is at an international level, that this issue of food security is met head on in as fair a way as possible. And these types of technologies, along with the hopes on, say, vertical farming and so on, mean that countries that find themselves at the end of the food supply chain, right, and that's a very precarious place to be, and
awful place.
Millions of people in some countries where they're very rich. Singapore is a very rich country. Japan, to an extent, you could say, the way Japan feels about being at the end of a long supply chain for oil, and they've had to develop nuclear energy, and they've had to look at ways they can be less dependent. Singapore is now having a similar discourse about food. And I think we'll see that when it comes to meat and protein, the Gulf nations and the Middle East as a whole is also at the end of quite a precarious food supply chain. And in Israel, much, certainly of the beef that's eaten today is also something that's imported from overseas, oftentimes,
live,
Brazil, Argentina, and sometimes live as well.
Live.
And so to look at the opportunity here, I think for any industry to really work, you need it to have potential for profit. You need for there to be an underlying, maybe national level support for it. And this approach to producing meat, I think, can align the interests of business. It can align the interests of people who are worried about national security. It can align with people who just believe in basic fairness of access to food. There are lots of questions about what's happening in Africa, who's buying the land in Africa, who should benefit from the food that's being grown in Africa. You'd think it might be the people that live there, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. And so any way, I think, that the means of production can be spread more equitably, and we're not hostage to the countries that happen to have the Pampas, or happen to have the grasslands of Texas, or happen to have some of the Amazon left.
Right.
Those places have a natural, you could say, advantage, but technology can perhaps level that playing field. And I think that's a phenomenal opportunity for fairness and stability.
Yes, and I think it's an opportunity missed for politicians not to see that, which is why Israel and Singapore are such leaders here. And I think of the United States as being very slow to get on board. But your comment about Africa, as I understand it, a lot of land is being bought up by the Chinese, and that food is exported out to China. So just some of the issues that happen around an unstable food supply system and the wars that could ensue therefrom. So as we wrap up here, I know it's very late for you in Israel now. Thank you for doing this. Just a couple exit questions, more kind of on a personal note. Here you're working in this mission-driven area. I'm wondering, what would you like to be known for?
So I think it's enough to be seen as being part of what I think at the moment is an exciting opportunity to really make a difference, and to be part of this industry as a whole, to see that the impact and the waves that it's making, and something that today may seem a little bit of a crazy idea, certainly for folks who come across it the first time. If one can be part of making that something that delivers on the promise and becomes part of everybody's day to day, I think that's satisfaction enough.
You'll take it.
It wouldn't be bad if it happens to be successful as well, of course. But really, the opportunity to get behind something and you see the difference it makes. People come to work knowing that they're working on something which there's a legacy which you'd want to be associated with.
You cut out there for a second, but yes, so we know what you're saying. There's a legacy there that is quite rewarding. Yes, it's wonderful to know that in addition to making money, you're leaving the world a better place. And I'll even say from a business perspective, it's a little bit of fairy dust. Those mission-aligned businesses, I think, really have that extra superpower, because there's nothing easy about being an entrepreneur. It's long hours, it's weekends, and Wednesdays look the same. There's no difference between a Saturday and a Wednesday because you're working so hard. So there's that little bit of fairy dust that gives you a little bit of extra wind in your sails to take it the extra mile. You have been at this a long time. You've lived in the States a little bit, I believe, and Stockholm, Sweden, and Israel now. But of course, you're from England, if I have that right, the UK. Mostly. But I'm wondering, so in this span of life that you've had thus far, what do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
Ooh, it's a good question. I think it's just that things are more possible than one thinks, and that bravery can go a long way, and not necessarily implying that I'm particularly brave, but it's what I've seen around me. And I think maybe this is also part of the atmosphere here in Israel, and being here has taught me that as well, which is that even when you think there isn't a way, or people tell you there isn't a way, oftentimes there may well be. And a lot of it comes down to having the grit to stick it out, and to having that leap of faith where you dare to try. So I think it's that more is possible than one might think, and one shouldn't shy away from doing. I think it's very easy, if one does too much analysis, to think about all the reasons one shouldn't. But actually, most of the endeavors that I've been involved in, at one point somebody just had to say, let's just do something and see what happens. And it can be big things and it can be small things. So I think just do it. To quote Nike, is not a bad way to start.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, you're running around doing things, and you have a day that doesn't go your way. I'm wondering if there's one phrase you tell yourself to get yourself back in the game.
Oh, so there are many phrases. I typically, it's Olympics time, So I often find myself musing on, onwards and upwards, and that's pretty much. And if you're down, you're not necessarily out. So yeah, setbacks have to be taken on the chin and see what one can do. The other one, another expression that I'm particularly fond of, which a friend of mine recently reminded me of, is the motto of the Royal Society in London, which is essentially, it's in Latin because it's old and has to be slightly fancy. So it's nullius in verba, which basically means don't take just anybody's word for it. You need to actually go and check things out as well. And I think that combination of just keeping on striving, but perhaps not believing things entirely until you get a chance to test them and really analyze them properly would be a good combination.
I love that. And I think a lot of people are feeling that way after COVID. Even the non-entrepreneur is feeling like, oh, I maybe took other people's advice on my own health. I maybe listened to doctors and governments, and maybe I won't do that anymore. Maybe I'll go figure it out for myself. Thanks, Google. And I'll start reading the back of that nutrition label. And maybe I'll realize, like, oh, hey, meat has many ingredients in it that I didn't really realize before because nobody was telling me. But, oh, that doesn't mean they're not there. So, you're seeing an empowered consumer base that would agree with you globally to start checking things out for your own health. Okay. Speaking of health and food, you are running around because you're a busy entrepreneur traveling the world, going everywhere. You said that you just landed in Israel from the United States yesterday. You're super busy. It's very late. You maybe ran around today and didn't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
Well, I actually try to keep it as healthy as possible. So my go-to snacks typically revolve around, and luckily they're oftentimes things that can be found in the Mediterranean as well. So people say, go for the Italian diet, the Mediterranean diet. One of those will be fine. Mostly you'll find me, if you give me the opportunity, I'll find myself some figs, some walnuts, some dates, and that's my sort of guilty pleasure. And luckily, I don't have to feel too guilty about them as long as I keep the quantities under control.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Those are my go-tos as well. And of course, you're in Israel, so some of the best hummus I've ever had, and great olives, and just a wonderful, wonderful diet. Well, Simon, I want to thank you for staying up into the wee hours of the night with us in Israel. Thank you for all you do. We will be watching intently the progress of MeaTech3D. Of course, they're on the NASDAQ, so you can kind of watch them every day if you want to from that perspective, but also all of the technological innovations that are coming down the pipeline. When will I get to try printed meat?
There's a big question. Certainly, the hybrid meats or the hybrid products one can try today. There's restaurants in Singapore serving those things. The hybrid products that we're working on in Belgium, we've had some taste tests recently. So it's coming soon.
Wait. So I thought I knew that Just had products, chicken, in Singapore. MeaTech3D does as well?
So we don't have anything for sale in Singapore, but the notion of the hybrid products that we're working on, and that's what we're doing with our subsidiary in Belgium. So we're internally doing the taste testing now.
Okay.
Obviously, the sooner that we can bring those to market, the happier we will be, and the happier our investors would be as well.
Yes, I'm sure they would be. Okay, well, clearly I just have to get myself to Israel so I can do a taste testing. I want to thank you for being here with me. Simon, you stay put, you don't go away. Everybody else on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, thank you also for all you do for spreading the word. Go ahead and share this video. Help keep the knowledge drop circulating. And of course, if you haven't yet subscribed to the Plant-Based Business Hour, go ahead and subscribe. And of course, write a 5-star review. It really does help. Bye, everybody. I'm on vacation next week, but I will see you in 2 weeks. Bye, all.